Okay, now I feel the pressure's on. We'll be in 1 Kings 18, if you'd like to flip there. And as Pastor Jim mentioned, my name is Jonathan Hibbets, in case you do not know me too personally or well. It's great to have been invited to speak again on one of these winter conference series. Today, it's always a little challenging to have to prepare for something that is so well known, because you figure everyone may have already learned everything that there is to learn about a story like this. And although I felt that way as I began my study, I was still taught a lot as I was reading through and studying this passage that I don't think I saw or connected before, and I just hope to bring that to you. Today, we're going to talk about egos. Egos describe a person's view of themselves, their self-importance, or how they compare themselves to others. We all have egos at some points, at some times, about some things, and egos aren't inherently bad. No, we're all given certain talents to be very good at things, and we're called to work hard and to do well in those talents that we do have. But if your ego goes unchecked, then it can lead to arrogance, it can lead to entitlement. And as we look at a big ego tonight, I wanted to share a radical example, a humorous example of what an unchecked ego can look like. And I'll ask you forgiveness for this because I am going into the soccer world for this one. So if you follow me on it, awesome. If not, Google some later. I promise you're going to be entertained. Because as I was thinking about egos, this was the first person that hopped in my head. He's a Swedish soccer player named Zlatan Ibrahimovic. He's very well known. He's very talented. He's gotten lots of awards, trophies. He's played for some of the highest tier teams in Europe. He's even played over here on the state side as well. But he's also consistently ranked as one of the most arrogant sports persons in the world in any sport. So as a way to highlight what an unchecked ego could look like, I went ahead and pulled some carefully curated quotes and reports just to highlight this point. And it's not meant to be a criticism to him because, again, he's very good at what he does, but he does have a large personality. And I want to share just a couple points with you about him. In the year 2000, he was 17 years of age. He was invited to try out for the Arsenal soccer team, which, if you're not familiar with Arsenal, they're a premier English soccer team. He got invited to try out, and his response to the coach upon receiving the invitation was, "No way. Zlatan does not do auditions." Yeah, he also has a tendency to speak about himself in the third person when he's doing interviews. He then took a record-breaking contract for another team called Ajax, which is a Dutch team, without any tryouts. They just hired him on the spot. In 2003, he trademarked the name Zlatan with the Swedish Patent and Registration Office. Well, that's his home country. And he trademarked it for, quote, most likely being perceived as Zlatan Ibrahimovic. So this was because his name and his reputation was getting so large that the media was turning his name into a verb, or he was being parodied on news networks and TV channels. So he trademarked his own name. In 2018, he decided, like some European soccer players do in their early retirement, to come stateside and play for the MLS. So he was signed with the LA Galaxy team, and to announce his joining the team, he took out a signed full-page advertisement in the LA Times that said, quote, "Dear Los Angeles, you're welcome." That was it. And I think my personal favorite is from around the same time that when he was playing with the MLS team in LA, it's around the same time that LeBron James was signed as an LA Laker. So upon hearing that, he tweeted about LeBron James being signed, and his tweet said, "Now LA has a god and a king." LeBron being King James, and he's referring to himself then as a god of soccer. As a sign of gratitude, it gets better. As a sign of gratitude, LeBron sent Zlatan a signed Lakers jersey And Zlatan mailed it back with his own autograph on it. So a big ego. Big ego. During our last sermon in series, Phil Grimmett was up here speaking 2 weeks ago. And I like that he ended his sermon setting the stage for the events of what we're going to be reading about and talking about tonight. We're going to see a big ego defeated. We're going to see a divine battle of proportions. We're going to see examples of righteous mocking. We're going to see fire fall from heaven, and we're going to see hearts changed. So I think since it's been 2 weeks, we'll do a quick recap to see where we've been so far. And then we will jump into things in 1 Kings 18. But in 1 Kings 16, we get introduced to Ahab and his wife Jezebel. They are king and queen in the northern kingdom of Israel. They both promote and they lead the northern kingdom in pagan idol worship. They worship Baal, and then they also worship the Asherah. Asherah was like the consort of Baal, whereas Baal was a storm god responsible for like the fertility of the land. So they both did great evil in the sight of the Lord. Phil made sure to mention that they did more evil than any of the previous kings that came before them. So their leadership of their people was truly to do whatever they thought was right in their own eyes, like that phrase that you see over and over again in the book of Judges. So they're not leading them in a way that is responsible. We see in 1 Kings 17 that Elijah hits the scene. And we're introduced to Elijah the Tishbite, who goes to King Ahab and delivers a message to him from God, saying that because of their wayward idolatry, God's going to send a drought to the land. And that drought's going to bring a subsequent famine. And the drought's going to last until Elijah says that it's done. And then God takes Elijah and preserves him away in the wilderness and puts his hand of protection upon him, staying with the widow for about 3 years. In 1 Kings 18, it's around sometime in that third year that God sends a message to Elijah saying, go back and present yourself again to King Ahab and tell him that I'm going to be ending the drought. And he does just that. We're going to pick up for ourselves 1 Kings 18. We're going to start at verse 17. So give ourselves a little bit of a running start. And there's a lot of verses here in the passage for tonight, so I'm going to break it up a little bit as we read through it, and then talk about different sections, and hopefully give us a good flow as we look through this story together. Starting in verse 17. We read at the end of verse 16, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. And in verse 17, when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, is it you, O troubler of Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore, send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. So this is their first time meeting each other again in roughly 3 years. Ahab's waiting to see the end of this drought come. It seems to be true to Elijah's word that until he meets him again, or until Elijah says so, the drought's going to persist. And what's the first thing that Ahab does? Well, he begins a verbal confrontation with Elijah, where immediately he calls him the troubler of Israel, essentially assigning all the blame of the drought to Elijah, saying, you have caused all of these troubles to come upon us. And Elijah counters. And he says, no, it was not me. I'm not the troubler, but it's you and your idolatry and your father's idolatry that, calls it abandoning the commandments of the Lord, that have brought this. So immediately we see a conflict between them, where over this 3-year period, it looks like that Ahab's heart hasn't really changed. But that's really what God wanted in this time. Like this 3-ish year drought was sent as a time of affliction that was supposed to change the hearts of the people in Israel, to bring them back to God. And he wants them to repent and to turn their hearts back to him and to seek him instead. But we can see Ahab doesn't do that. He instead assigns the blame to Elijah. We already know that Ahab does not like Elijah. Phil mentioned that in his sermon 2 weeks ago, that he and Jezebel put a bounty out on his head, trying to eliminate him. So let's see what happens from there. We'll go verse 19 to 24 as our first section. In verse 19, Elijah issues his challenge. He says, "Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." And the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophet are 450 men. Let 2 bowls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bowl for themselves, and cut it into pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bowl, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people answered, "It is well spoken." So Elijah has gone with this goal in mind. Right? God has sent him with a message. He is to go and confront Ahab. And I think we can say, and we'll be able to justify this later, that this isn't Elijah's plan. It's not his own doing. He's not reacting to Ahab's conflict here, but that this is God's plan from the start, that he is sending Elijah for this purpose, to deliver this message and this challenge to Ahab, so that way the people of Israel can see that God truly is the God of Israel. When Elijah issues this challenge to Ahab, he kind of expresses that this isn't really in his favor from a human standpoint. And I can imagine from Ahab's point of view, it's probably just inflating that ego more and more. Look at what Elijah is saying. He notes that he's alone in this. He says, only I am the prophet of the Lord, whereas the prophets of Baal are 450 men. Now, that's not to mention the 400 prophets of Asherah, who, after verse 19, seem to disappear from the story. So commentators believe that they're here as well, and whether or not they're partaking in this same part of the story or not, we're just not told. But 400 to 850 prophets of these idols are summoned together. Not only that, but people from Israel. We don't know how many people are gathered together, but Ahab brings a crowd. He's bringing as many people together as he can to witness what's going to happen. And these people, maybe they share the same opinion as Ahab. Maybe they don't view Elijah as a good person. Maybe they also think that he is the troubler of Israel, and they assign the blame to him still. I think it's probably safe to say that he didn't have many allies in that audience, and perhaps not when he started talking to them. And then the challenge itself. Elijah says that, they're going to offer a sacrifice, and whichever God is going to answer the call of their prophets, that must be the real God. Ahab must be thinking, this is great, because not only is it 450 to 850 versus 1, not only is it a crowd that are probably not viewing Elijah in the best light, but also they have the home field advantage. Because what's not expressed here, what I learned from reading commentators on this, is that Mount Carmel, where they're having this showdown, this was a spot right in between Israel and Phoenicia, which is the land of where these pagan gods are stemming from. The Phoenicians regarded Mount Carmel as the sacred dwelling place of Baal. And it's likely a high place of worship where they would do some of their paganistic rituals. And Baal's a storm god, like bringing down lightning or fire. That's kind of his thing. So the home field advantage seems to be theirs, and it looks like Elijah has just walked into a very bad circumstance for himself. But Elijah has a different goal here. Right? If we're really trying to weigh what the goal of Elijah and Ahab is, Elijah's goal was to show the people that it's Yahweh who is the true God. Right? The challenge that he gives to them, look at how he addresses the people when they get there. He says, how long we go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal, then follow him. And Elijah's trying to address for them this limping back and forth. He's trying to address that syncretism that had developed in the culture, where they were trying their best to also worship Yahweh, worship God, but also to bring in these idol practices and tried to marry the two religions together. And it made them very lukewarm. And when I was reading this, it really brought to my mind Joshua's challenge at the end of the book of Joshua, in Joshua 24. Don't need to flip there. I'll read it for us. It's only 2 verses. So in Joshua 24, 14 and 15, Joshua challenges the people of Israel. He says, now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods of your ancestors, worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites and the land who you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. A very similar challenge given by Elijah here, perhaps even for them evoking the word of Joshua coming back. That's Elijah's goal. Ahab's goal, however, he wants to defeat Elijah. He wants the problem gone. He wants rain to come back. He's viewing Elijah as the troubler, the cause of all this. If he can attain victory here, then perhaps things will turn around for him. And he feels like he has a home field advantage. Let's see what happens from there. We'll start at verse 25. I'll go to 29. Verse 25, then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose for yourselves one bull and prepare it first, for you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it. And they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, cry it aloud, for he is a god. Either he is amusing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey. Perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their customs with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of offering of the oblation. And there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. So as we begin the challenge, Elijah goes a step further. He says, let me give you a greater advantage. We've got these bowls. Choose whichever one you want. You could even start first. Choose whichever one you think is best. Go ahead and begin. You can start calling to your God first. It gives him a chance to maybe be the first one to send fire. It gives him that opportunity. And we want to note here what the sacrifice is, because I think that there's significance here. That Elijah's challenge is the sacrifice of a bull, which us reading on this side of the pages might make the connection that a bull sacrifice and a burned offering was typically used as a sin offering. So what Elijah's really doing is he is preparing to give a sin offering on behalf of an unrepentant northern kingdom because their leadership hasn't been repenting for their sins from idolatry. And we read that from 9 o'clock until noon, so from morning till noon, roundabouts, they're calling on the name of Baal. They're doing their ritualistic worship, their summons. We're told that they're limping about the altar, and we're told that there's no response. Elijah engages in some righteous mocking, which I will not give any advice about, because I don't feel like I can, but I think Elijah's in the right in saying what he says. He is, after all, here to deliver a message from God, and he's on God's side on this one, so it must be okay for him to do this. But he's driving them into a fervor. He's noticing that they're getting no response. He knows that they're not going to, and he begins to mock them. saying, well, if your God is real, if he is there, then maybe you need to call louder. Maybe he can't hear you. Maybe he's in the bathroom. Maybe he's on a journey, which is one belief that they had, which is if you were going on like a sea journey, then Baal would travel with you. So maybe he's just off on a journey right now and hasn't returned yet. And all he's doing is just stirring them up. So what do? They double down on their efforts. They begin to engage in more radical versions of their paganistic worship. They begin to mutilate themselves in a showing of dedication as a chance to rouse their God into action, which was something as part of their worship. And we begin to see here the showdown starts. But imagine the boredom for the people of Israel. Right? This goes on for 3 hours of watching them. Nothing happens. There's 450-ish of these prophets. It probably didn't take very long for them to get going. And they're watching. They're expecting to see something spectacular here. And they probably get bored. And perhaps Elijah's trying to just build in on that too. Maybe he sees the boredom of the people. Maybe when Scripture says that no one answered, or when it says that no one paid attention, maybe it also refers to the people that are there watching, that they begin to lose interest in what's happening with these prophets. It seems like their God isn't coming. He isn't answering. So perhaps Elijah is using this as an opportunity to sort of win the crowd over to him. And although this is part of the historical texts in the Old Testament, this passage does go a little bit out of order chronologically, because we read about the events that the prophets of Baal took, and now we're going to read about the order of events for Elijah. So this is happening now around probably morning to about noon when Elijah is going to start taking action. We're told at noon he gives his righteous mocking, but up till now we haven't seen Elijah take any actions yet. He needs to also prepare his own sacrifice. So we'll pick up where we left off on on verse 30. Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." And all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench about the altar, as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order, and cut the bowl into pieces, and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar, and filled the trench also with water. So at this point, Elijah calls people to himself. Again, maybe they're bored. He calls them to himself, and he begins to, I think, stir them up in their own history. Right? He starts by rebuilding the altar that was to God there. So there was one that was there that was previously destroyed. Chances are it was probably viewed as one of the high places that used to have been there that was then destroyed, likely after the temple was built. So in accordance to Old Testament law, it was probably torn down. But Elijah's building it back up, and he's reminding them with those 12 stones of their history, one for each tribe, saying that they are the people to be called Israel. And then not only that, he's building the anticipation, right? He does his preparations, but he builds that trench. He has them pour the water on, not once, not twice, but 3 times. The people must be wondering what's going to happen now. He's doing something different. This seems exciting. And to Elijah, like, he knows what's going to happen, perhaps. Maybe he doesn't. But he knows that he's just working in accordance to God's plan. But his goal for behind this drenching of the sacrifice might be is to let the people know that if his God does answer, if the God of Israel responds and sends fire, then that must be the only explanation. Everything is wet. Any sort of natural fire is not going to take place. He can't do any sleight of hand to light it himself. No other explanation other than some sort of divine action could set fire to this soaked altar with its bowl, its wood, and its stones. So as the anticipation grows, I want to pause there, because we know that the crescendo of the story is about to come. But I think it's a good point to pause and just ask a question, that why was this a trial by fire in the first place? Right, there must have been a reason that this was God's plan. There must be a reason why this is what Elijah had presented Ahab with. And I want to come up with some plausible explanations other than the one that I think is true. And I think that there's some merit to all of these. But I want to just present 3 ideas that I had for why it might be trial by fire. The first one, because fire from heaven, it's always special, convincing, and super cool. Right? If that happens, you can't help but be convinced that it's some sort of supernatural thing has occurred. Right? It has to change minds. It has to grab attention. And we know that has to be the case too, because in Revelation 13, right, this is supposed to be one of the signs that the false prophet does to give credibility to the Antichrist. Right? One of those fake miracles that are going to happen is fire will be called down, and it's supposed to be to build up the Antichrist. So we know it has to be attention-grabbing, whether then or in the future. Okay, option 2. Perhaps God wanted to beat Baal at his own game. Right? If Baal's the storm god, he can send lightning. God wants to say, I can do it better. Right? Then he's trying to prove to the people of Israel that he's just the better God, the better option, where he could send better fire. Again, I don't think that's the real reason. I think that there's a surface level of reasonableness there. I think it's what the people are expecting. Right? That was Elijah's challenge to them. We'll see which God responds, and then that's going to be the true God that we follow. And all the people said, okay, yeah, that seems reasonable. So I think the people are kind of expecting that to happen, but I don't think that was really God's reason for this. And here's the real reason, I think. I think it was to evoke in the mind of the Israelites the significance of what was about to happen, the significance of fire from heaven that consumes a sacrifice. Because in their history, there's recorded events where that happens. There's also events of fire sent for judgment too, but we're talking about sacrifices here specifically. And I think there's 3 events that Elijah might want to evoke for them. And I want to go through these, and I've got them prepared up here to read. If you want to flip to the references, you can, or if you just want to, for note-taking purposes, write them down, you can do that too. The first will be in Leviticus chapter 9. We'll look at 3 events that I think Elijah and God want to evoke in the minds of the Israelites. In Leviticus 9, verses 23 and 24, we read, And Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting, and when they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the pieces of fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. Okay, so what's happening here is this was the first sacrifice at the tabernacle. Right? So before this in Leviticus, it's all the laws of the offerings. Read that chapter after chapter. Then they consecrated the tabernacle. Then they performed this sacrifice. And this is also going to be a handing off of this sacrificial rite from Moses to Aaron and the Levites, saying, well, this is now your role, is to perform these sacrifices. And God's acceptance of the sacrifice, seen by him consuming it with fire, not only showed that God was present there in the acceptance, but also that he's present at the tabernacle, that this is now where he's going to dwell. So perhaps it would make them think of that. Here's a second story that they might recall. This one comes from 1 Chronicles chapter 21. 1 Chronicles 21. In 1 Chronicles 21, we see David at a little bit of a low point. David had been tricked. He had taken a census of the people of Israel. He wasn't supposed to. And because he had disobeyed God, God had sent pestilence upon the land. And his people are being punished for his own wrongdoing. And David's praying to God, asking, can God show mercy to his people and punish him instead? Because it was his own choice and action after all. And he sees what's happening to his people. And David praying for mercy gets a response from God, and God working through an angel that is currently his hand of judgment tells him that he needs to go to the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, and he needs to perform a sacrifice there. So David goes onto Mount Moriah. He sees the angel, and David describes it. He says he sees the angel with his sword turned towards Jerusalem, and he wants to see that his hand of judgment stayed. So David goes, talks to Ornan, agrees to purchase his land from him fairly, pays him a ton of money, even though Ornan was willing to just give it to him. He said, no, it has to cost him something. So David pays him for the land. David provides his own animals for sacrifice, and David performs sacrifices there. And that's where we pick up in verse 26. Verse 26, we read, "And David built there an altar to the Lord and presented burnt offerings and peace offerings and called on the Lord. And the Lord answered him with fire from heaven upon the altar of the burnt offering. And the Lord commanded the angel, and he put his sword back into his sheath. At that time, when David saw that the Lord had answered him at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, he sacrificed there. For the tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses had made in the wilderness, and the altar of burnt offering were at the time in the high place at Gibeon. But David could not go there, could not go before it to inquire of God, for he was afraid of the sword of the angel of the Lord. And David said, Here shall be the house of the Lord God, and here the altar of burnt offering for Israel." So the fire here, it showed God's acceptance of David's offering, his offering for his own sin guilt, but it also gave a foreshadowing. God's presence was there too, because the site that David had purchased, we see it there in chapter 22, verse 1. He says, "Here shall be the house of the Lord God, and an altar of burnt offering for Israel." This was the future site of the temple. And it's here that David began the work and then got Solomon to finish the construction of the temple on Mount Moriah at that very site. So God's perhaps foreshadowing that this is where he's going to be placing his presence, like he had shown his presence at the tabernacle. So maybe that's the second thing that God and Elijah wanted the people of Israel to remember. If we look at the third one that I think they might want to evoke in their minds, it's found in 2 Chronicles chapter 7. And this is a companion passage to what we would read in 1 Kings chapter 8. But in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 1, we see that Solomon has completed the construction of the temple in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, and he's offering a prayer of dedication, and he's giving sacrifices to God. 2 Chronicles 7, verse 1 reads, "As soon as Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple." So perhaps we're seeing that foreshadowing fulfilled here. Now, Solomon has given the sacrifices at the temple. God has sent his fire down, showing acceptance of those sacrifices and his presence at that site, as he is now going to be at the temple. Here's an interesting thing, however, that I think might be like a side part of perhaps what is God's plan to evoke for them. It's found in 2 Chronicles chapter 6. It's part of Solomon's prayer to God as he's dedicating the temple to him. And in 2 Chronicles 6, verses 26 and 27, listen to this. Solomon prays and he says, "When heaven is shut up and there is no rain because they have sinned against you, if they pray toward this place and acknowledge your name and turn from their sin, when you afflict them, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, your people Israel, when you teach them the good way in which they should walk, and grant rain upon the land, which you have given to your people as an inheritance." I think that's what God wanted to remind them of. He wanted to remind them that he is a jealous God, yes, but he is a gracious God who has promised to forgive them if they turn their hearts back to him and away from the sin in which they are currently going. He's afflicting them not just because he's mean. He's afflicting them because he wants them to realize that their dependence is on God. And the drought was due to their sin. And he desires their repentance overall, not their suffering, because he's promised to forgive them there. I think think these might be three things that God and Elijah want the people of Israel to be reminded of. So let's see the crescendo happen. We're back in 1 Kings chapter 18. We're at verse 36. And at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, The Lord, he is God. The Lord, all capital letters, Yahweh, he is God. And Elijah said to them, Seize the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. So we see this out of time sort of telling of the story happening at the time of oblation. So at the time when we're reading that no one answered, no one was paying attention to the prophets of Baal, Elijah steps forward, gathering the people there, and he prays. I want to just pull three things from Elijah's prayer that we can see here that I want to parallel in a few moments. Three things to pull out from Elijah's prayer. First is that Elijah's saying that it was God's plan all along. That's where I'm saying we can justify this idea from. It was God's plan, not Elijah's plan. And Elijah was just a servant acting for God. In verse 36, it says, Let all the people know that I am your servant and that I have done all these things at your word. So Elijah's just carrying out a plan that he was given. The second thing I want us to pull from Elijah's prayer here is that he prays that God makes it known that he is the true God of Israel. We see this in verses 36 and 37. In verse 36, it says, Let it be known this day that you are God in Israel. And in verse 37, he says, Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God. And the third thing is that Elijah prays that God will turn their hearts back to himself. Ending in verse 37, the prayer that he gave, it says, And that you have turned their hearts back. Which I think that the grammar there is pretty fantastic. It's not a hopeful wish that they will turn back, but a knowing that their hearts have been turned back, and it's God who has done it. And we see God respond in a mighty way as the crescendo of the story happens, and fire, boom, is sent down. And if you're worried about the altar being reconstructed at the high place, and I mentioned that was against Old Testament law earlier, don't worry, God got rid of the altar. Because it wasn't just a mere strike of lightning, perhaps. It was a fire so divine, so powerful, that we read that it consumed the altar, it consumed the sacrifice, the water, the stones, the dust on the ground, gone. Nothing there anymore. And the people responded in worship. Worship of a God that has sought them out to redeem them. And we can see the response of their changed hearts. That when Elijah says, Seize those prophets, whether it's 450 prophets of Baal or the 850, including the prophets of Asherah, which I think that all 850 were included here, they did that. They took them down the north side of that mountain valley to the brook, killed them all. Killed them all, perhaps ending the idolatry that they're historically at this point partaking in. Perhaps ending this stain on the part of their story that's there. But imagine Ahab. Ahab's watching it all. Ahab's not killed here, no. He's king after all. But he sees what happens, right? He sees fire sent down. He realizes he's not on the winning side. He watches the 850 prophets get rounded up, killed, and if we follow the story here, we can see he's probably down at the brook with everyone else. He's witnessing all of this happening, but I don't think at any point does his ego move away from a Zlatan-sized ego that he has. I think he keeps the same big-headedness and arrogance that he's always had here. Let's read ahead and see some of that. We'll go from verse 41 to 46, finishing up our section tonight. Verse 41 says, And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is a sound of the rushing of rain." So he's telling Ahab to go back up. So they've descended the mountain, they've killed the prophets, and he's telling him, go back, go have some food. So I think Ahab was there. In verse 42, so Ahab went up to eat and drink, and Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel, and he bowed himself down on the earth and put his face between his knees, and he said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." And he went up and looked and said, "There is nothing." And Elijah said, "Go again." And he said that 7 times. And at the 7th time he said, "Behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea." And he said, "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stop you." And in a little while the heavens grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he gathered up his garment and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. So we see that God also remains true to his promise. Like he had sent Elijah with that message of, hey, I'm back. I said that the rains will stop until I say otherwise. I'm here to bring the rains back. And as Elijah prays, God opens up the waters of rain again. And he sees this great storm coming, not a trickle, but a great storm coming to just wash everything, I suppose, to make everything wet again. And then Ahab goes to Jezreel. Elijah goes to Jezreel, perhaps thinking that this whole Baal incident's over, that perhaps it's just done with. But we're going to see that God's not done yet. Ahab and Jezebel, they're not done yet. Elijah's not done yet. And the story's not over. My portion of it is. But our next speaker, Ernie, is going to pick up from here, and will start taking us through chapter 19. But I want to talk a little application the time that we have. I've got a little time. And this is a popular story for Elijah, and I think it's the one that we all know. But I can't help but feel that after reading through this and talking through it with you today, that I start to feel that Elijah type of zeal sort of well up within myself, and I might look around and think in the culture and in the world, and perhaps in my own life, looking at idols. I'm like, that upsets me. And in that zeal, I also want to see God tear them down. I want to see him send fire from heaven and turn the hearts of America, of Ypsilanti, of our families. I want to see God take that action as well. And the simple, easy application here might just be resist idolatry. It might just be when you see it, pray about it. But I want to go a little bit deeper into something that I think God showed to me, that I found to be rather impactful for myself. And it's not to say that those 2 previous things are bad desires. No, I think that those are great. But I think that although we desire God to take action in that way, I think he already has. I think he has. Because I want to take us to another sacrifice like this one. I want to take us to what happens after the next Elijah comes in the New Testament. John the Baptist. We read about another sin offering that is given. But the offering in this case wasn't a bull. It was Jesus. So if you want to flip with me here, it's in Matthew 27 is the section that I chose to read for this one. Matthew 27, this is, for the book of Matthew, this is where the crucifixion takes place. And I said I wanted to make a parallel between Elijah's prayer and something else. I want to try to parallel it with this in just a moment. First, let me read through this. Matthew 27, we'll start at verse 39 and go to verse 54. In verse 39, we read, "And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, 'You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross.' So also the chief priests and the scribes and elders mocking him, saying, 'He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him. For he said, I am the Son of God.' And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, 'Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?' That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "Oh, this man is calling Elijah." And one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. But the other said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after this resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." So I want to parallel some of this with what we saw in the sacrifice with Elijah. First, I want to start with the mocking. In Elijah's story, he did the mocking, righteous mocking. I think he was doing because he was on the side of God. But in Matthew, it's Jesus who instead is getting mocked. It's God on the cross who's being mocked by those who are passing by and by the officials. I thought that the time was interesting to note between the two, because in the story for Elijah, we read that from noon until 3, there was no answer for the prophets of Baal. There was anticipation building up, but there was no answer. Elijah built his own anticipation as he gathered people to himself before praying at 3 o'clock, which was the time for the evening sacrifice to happen. And from noon to 3, darkness was over the land as Jesus hung there dying on the cross, absorbing the full wrath of God. Imagine the anticipation building up for those that are there at the cross, watching the supernatural darkness, seeing Jesus hanging there, whether enemy or friend, just wondering what's going to happen. Will he save himself? Will he not? And 3 hours of building anticipation results in, at the time of oblation, Jesus saying, and to pull from a passage from John, at a similar telling of the story, John 19:30 says, "It is finished." So when we read here in the passage of Matthew that Jesus cries out, this is what he was saying. It's finished. And then he gives his spirit up, saying that he surrenders his own life. So instead of fire being sent down, we instead see the Son of God giving up his own life on the cross. And here's where I want to pull the parallel. So we can see the same 3 elements of Elijah's prayer exemplified here in this sacrifice as well. And I'll be quick with it. First, Jesus faithfully submitted to God's will in this, just like Elijah was a servant sent from God. We see that in Jesus' prayer in the garden, that he willingly submitted himself to something that was going to be physically unpleasant and something that humanistically he did not want to do. But he still submitted himself to God's will and went forward with this plan. Secondly, God displayed his power. Right? We see the darkness for 3 hours. We see the earthquakes, the rocks splitting, the curtain of the temple being torn in two, the resurrection of the dead, other powerful signs of supernatural intervention at work there that must result in people looking around and absorbing it, thinking no other thing than God must be doing this. But we also see the deity of Christ here. We see that Jesus is the Messiah. And to pull from some things that we know, having been on this side of Scripture, knowing the fuller story, we see that Jesus' payment for sin is accepted. Right? He says it is finished, or it is paid in full. He's giving up his own life willingly. And later we'll see that he's resurrected and then ascended. We see that Jesus is the Messiah there. Just like for Elijah's sacrifice, God was showing his acceptance and his presence there to forgive the sins of Israel. And third, that Jesus turns the hearts of God's people back to himself as well, just like God's purpose for the drought and Elijah's sacrifice. We can see this perhaps in the centurion, not to sensationalize or assume what happens in that centurion's life, but we do see his response in verse 54, that the centurion and others with him who've been keeping watch over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and what took place, filled with awe, and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God. They recognized the signs that were there, and whether that turned their hearts to God and they were saved at that point, we don't know. But we do know that from this point forward, God's been in the business of changing the hearts of wayward, idolatrous people back to himself. We read about that all through the New Testament, that anyone who believes in him in faith, he will forgive and bring into his own fold. So as we end, I'll say, let's hold fast to this story. Let's not lose our zeal, but let's not forget that God has taken action. But this time, we're the ones who are supposed to go out. We're the messengers to tell this story. We're the ones who are supposed to carry the gospel of Christ to those around us and tell them about the sacrifice that God had made for us to redeem us to himself. And let us continually seek God's face as we do this. At this point, I'll invite Pastor Jim back up to close things out.